The CCP began one of its first rounds of this in the late 1940s, just months after then Communist leader Mao Zedong took power. The Communist Party launched a so-called land reform campaign. Mao mobilized the nation's poorest peasants, ordering them to violently seize the land controlled by landlords. Many landlords were beaten to death during these communist struggle sessions. To justify the killing, the CCP first had to make sure Chinese society held widespread hatred toward landlords. If there was no pre-existing hatred, the CCP would create it.
The CCP taught us back then that the landlords were cruelly exploiting the peasants, and that the peasants and the landlords were in an antagonistic relationship.
Tan Song is the author of The Bloody Red Land, a collection of interviews about the CCP's land reform campaign. The former professor was expelled from his university in China for conducting research on the atrocities that happened during the campaign. He interviewed over 100 Chinese people who personally experienced the movement.
When we talked with the peasants, we found out that the real situation was nothing like the CCP's account. The peasants were more willing to work for the landlords rather than in the CCP's people's communes. And all the peasants I contacted held this opinion.
Higher estimates say 5 million landlords were killed during land reform across China. The CCP sent several million others to labor camps, where many perished. The landlords also suffered painful deaths.
During the land reform in Hunan province, there was a village where 2 landlords were nailed to death with iron nails. Some landlords were forced to dig their own graves and were buried alive.
What's more, land isn't the only area the CCP has sought to reform. In August 1966, a Beijing resident returned home to Beijing from his university. At the time, the high points of the CCP's Cultural Revolution were in full swing. One weekend, he and his brother went out to buy breakfast, but what he witnessed that day stayed with him since then. On their way, they passed a Catholic church near the city's Suanwu Gate.
When I passed by the church, I saw that the doorway was crowded with people. When I got to the door, I saw 20 to 30 nuns standing at the door, and the church staff in their uniforms were bowing their heads, and a group of red guards surrounded them, shouting, "Down with God."
When he walked to another of the church's doors, Ma saw a middle-aged man lying on the ground. A group of red guards, or Communist Party guards, wearing yellow military uniforms, surrounded him. The guards forced him to shout "Down with God" and threatened to kill him if he refused.
This man was shaking. He said, "I do not dare to shout. I do not dare to shout. I have been a believer since my childhood. I do not dare to shout." And then the red guards rushed to him like a pack of wolves, using belts with copper head to hit his head. His head was soon gushing blood. He fell to the ground, twitched for a while, then stopped making sounds.
This was just the start of the CCP's 10-year Cultural Revolution. Mao Zedong started the movement to bolster his personality cult and get rid of his political opponents. In August 1966, Mao wrote a letter of enthusiastic support to the Red Guards. At that time, they were mainly middle school students in Beijing who vowed to eliminate anyone not towing the Maoist line. The vice principal of a middle school in Beijing was tortured and beaten by her students and the Red Guards for several hours on campus before passing away. They used what became a favorite torture method. Whipping people with leather belts fitted with heavy metal buckles. That month was later dubbed Red August for the series of massacres that followed. And that's not the worst of it. As unbelievable as it sounds, China even saw cases of human cannibalism during the Cultural Revolution. That's according to the CCP's own records, smuggled to the U.S. Chinese state-run media has also published articles confirming the reports. A 1993 New York Times report called Guangxi's situation the most extensive episodes of cannibalism in the world in the last century or more. It explains that these cases were different. because those who took part were not motivated by hunger or psychopathic illness. Instead, the actions took place in public, were organized by local Communist Party officials, and people took part in them together to prove their revolutionary ardor to the CCP. Citing Chinese government documents, the newspaper reported that at some high schools, students killed their principals in the school courtyard and then cooked and ate the bodies to celebrate a triumph over counter-revolutionaries. Song Yong-yi is a Chinese historian and lecturer at the California State University in Los Angeles. He tells a story about how a local branch of China's communist government essentially forced people to eat others.
There was a low-ranking militia named Ling Youyuan. Although this man was also a murderer, he did not eat people at first. The minister of the country's military department, Wang Yituan, told him, "You go down and kill someone, and after the killing, bring me back the liver. We want to burn it and eat it." Ling asked himself, "How can I do that?" So the first time he resisted. When he came back, the minister warned him that, "Next time, if you fail to carry out this order again, we will eat you." This militia then actively began killing people, cutting out their livers and taking their gallbladders.
Song included many other such cases in his research, detailing the state-sponsored violence. The CCP's official records say that during the decades-long Cultural Revolution, over 130,000 people were executed on charges of being counter-revolutionary. Over 200,000 were beaten to death during violent struggle sessions, organized by party officials, and over 7 million suffered permanent injuries. Experts say studying the dark history is necessary.
Why do we still want to go back to this period of history? It has a very important meaning. That is, it allows us to understand the nature of the Chinese Communist Party. The Communist Party may change its leaders, but will not change itself to be better.
Western democracies have engaged with the Chinese regime since the 1970s, opening their markets and economies to Beijing. That's under the belief that the more China was exposed to democratic values and the more it succeeded financially, that the country would eventually stop killing and embrace democracy.
Has its history of killing people, its nature of killing people changed after China's economic power has greatly improved? No. For example, it can carry out large-scale suppression against and massacre hundreds of millions of Falun Gong practitioners, and even unprecedented crimes like organ harvesting. It's also implemented genocidal policies against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. It continues to persecute and kill people on a large scale, precisely because it has the ability to persecute people on a large scale after it became more economically powerful. And now we see more than that. Now we see that the Chinese Communist Party has unapologetically and openly declared that it will dominate the world order. If the CCP is really allowed to replicate and spread its model to the international community, then in the future, the same tragedies that have happened repeatedly in mainland China will definitely happen in other countries.
Despite the century of bloodshed brought on by this ideology, 36% of American millennials say they approve of communism, while 70% say they believe socialism, the initial stage of communism, is a great idea. That's according to a 2019 poll.
The evil ideology of communism has two sides. It has its violent and cruel side, and at the same time, it's very good at deception. When communism first appeared in mainland China, it also used beautiful slogans and very tempting social prospects to attract people to join, to attract people to identify with it. But only when it came to power would it reveal its true face. Those are the tragedies we saw in mainland China, in the Soviet Union, in Cambodia. We have seen too many of these tragedies over and over.